I thought this ruined studio might shelter me, but someone had left it waiting.
She was 25 and homeless. No home, no savings, no family support, just a canvas bag and $7 she had hidden in her sock. After leaving the house on the cold night, her sister locked the door behind her. And with that $7, she bought a forgotten stenciled wall painter's studio near Eaton, Carroll County, New Hampshire, in 1987, the year the old place fell off local maps. The roof sagged above rotten rafters, the floorboards hid decades of dust and pigment. Carroll County condemned the studio in 2023, scheduling its demolition for the winter of 2024. Beneath the studio's dried pigment barrel, a sealed second bottom waited decades unopened, holding a collection that would change Willa's life. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Willa Hart had been collecting pieces of forgotten things her whole life without knowing it. She grew up in a small farmhouse outside Concord, where her father repaired old furniture and her mother kept a garden beside the kitchen window. Before school, Willa swept the workshop floor and placed loose nails into a coffee tin. Her father never called those chores. He called them learning where things belonged. The house changed after her parents died. The rooms became quieter, and the objects that once carried memories became numbers written on papers. Willa's older sister Mara took control of the estate, saying she was protecting what their parents left behind. At first, Willa believed her. Her father had kept one thing that never lost its value to him, the patience to make something useful from something overlooked. A cracked chair could become a strong chair again. A faded wall could hold a story beneath the paint. That lesson returned to Willa years later through Professor Eleanor Voss, the only person who noticed that Willa spent more time studying old surfaces than modern designs. Eleanor taught restoration and decorative arts at a small college in New Hampshire. She wore the same grey wool coat every winter, even when the buttons no longer matched. Every Saturday morning, she unlocked the studio classroom before anyone arrived, brewed weak coffee, and placed a stack of damaged stencil papers on the long wooden table. Those mornings became Willa's quiet education. They cut patterns from oil-treated paper, following the shapes that old craftsmen used when wallpaper was too expensive for rural families. Eleanor showed her how a small round brush should be held loosely, how mineral pigments needed time before they became paint, and how a wall could carry the fingerprints of the person who decorated it. They practiced bell flowers, willow leaves, and simple rosette patterns. They mixed iron oxide powder with milk paint until the colour settled into something that looked older than the hand applying it. One Saturday, while Willa struggled with a crooked stencil line, Eleanor placed her hand over Willa's and gently corrected the angle. Beauty is kept by careful hands, not wealthy ones. Willa remembered those words because Eleanor never spoke about art as decoration. She spoke about it as a form of care. A painted wall could make a cold room feel like someone had remembered it. When Eleanor died, the college cleared her small office within days. Her original stencil boards, brushes, and notebooks disappeared into different storage rooms before Willa could claim them. The craft that Eleanor had spent decades protecting seemed to become another forgotten thing. Then Mara began making decisions about the family property. At first, she asked Willa to sign papers she claimed were routine. Then the requests became urgent. Mara arrived with folders, spoke quickly, and never sat down. She wore expensive perfume and checked her phone between sentences. "The market is terrible right now," Mara said. "This is the only practical choice." Willa later learned that the signatures were not what Mara claimed they were. The inherited farmhouse and remaining assets were sold to cover Mara's gambling debts. The money meant for both sisters disappeared into accounts Willa never saw. On a grey afternoon in March, Willa returned home carrying a grocery bag with a few cans inside. Her bedroom had already been emptied. Her father's wooden toolbox sat beside the front door. Mara stood near the kitchen counter without looking up. Willa picked up the toolbox and asked, "Where am I supposed to go now?" Mara folded a document and placed it on the table. "You should have signed when I asked you. 8 words." That was all she gave her. The final thing Willa noticed was her mother's old photograph still hanging above the sink. Her mother had always hated arguments. Even then, the frame remained perfectly straight, and the glass reflected the empty room instead of a person willing to defend her. For 6 weeks, Willa carried what she owned through southern New Hampshire and Vermont. She slept one night beneath the covered entrance of a closed train station in Nashua. She spent another in the back corner of a church shelter in Keene. In Manchester, she washed dishes for meals and slept on a borrowed blanket behind a community centre. Her $7 became $5, then $3. She stopped buying coffee. She stopped taking buses unless the distance was impossible to walk. She learned which libraries stayed open late and which benches were hidden from the wind. The cold was not the hardest part. It was the feeling that every place had a door, but none of them opened for her. One rainy afternoon, inside the public library in Concord, Willa found an old classified advertisement pinned to a community board. Most notices were about furniture sales, lost pets, or yard work. This one was different. Abandoned decorative studio. Eaton area. Property transfer available. $7 fee. The paper was yellowed and the ink had faded. Below the advertisement was a county contact number. Willa read it 3 times. She knew the building would be damaged. She knew there was no guarantee of shelter. She knew $7 was almost everything she had left. But the words decorative studio stayed with her. They reminded her of Eleanor's Saturday mornings. They reminded her of brushes tapping against paper. They reminded her that forgotten things sometimes still had a purpose. The next morning, Willa used her last money to buy a bus ticket north. She carried one canvas bag, one more. and the quiet hope that somewhere beneath the dust, something had been waiting for careful hands. The bus left Willa beside a narrow road outside Eaton just after sunrise, with frost still holding to the grass along the shoulder. She had travelled nearly 130 miles from Concord. The final stretch had no public transportation, so she walked the remaining distance with her canvas bag pressed against her side. The temperature had fallen to 18 degrees Fahrenheit that morning. Her boots sank into frozen mud, and by late afternoon she reached a small hay barn owned by a farmer who allowed travellers to sleep beneath the empty loft. She spent that night on old straw beneath a wooden beam marked with decades of initials carved by people who had passed through before her. The wind moved through gaps in the boards, but the hay held enough warmth to let her sleep. At dawn, she thanked the farmer, walked another 9 miles, and followed the road toward Eaton. The town was small enough that most buildings seemed to know one another. Near the centre stood a collection of places that had survived longer than anyone expected. Parker's general store with its faded green awning, Whitcomb Hardware with shelves visible through dusty windows, Maple Leaf Cafe beside the post office, Eaton Mill Supply with stacks of lumber behind the building, and the small Eaton Historical Society room above the old fire station. Willa noticed something about the town immediately. Nobody hurried. People moved carefully, as if every action still mattered. She found the county clerk's office inside a brick building that had once been a schoolhouse. The hallway smelled faintly of paper, floor wax, and old radiator heat. A brass sign beside the door read Carroll County Property Records. Behind the front desk sat a woman in her late 60s with silver hair twisted into a neat bun. A small scar crossed the back of her left hand, and she used that hand to organize papers into perfect stacks. Her nameplate read, Margaret Ellis, County Clerk. I am here about the studio transfer, Willa said. Margaret looked at the paperwork, then at Willa's worn coat and canvas bag. You understand what you're purchasing? Yes, ma'am. The county has marked the structure unsafe. Yes, ma'am. The roof requires repair before anyone spends a night there. Yes, ma'am. The property cannot be resold until certain restrictions are cleared. Yes, ma'am. Margaret studied her for a moment. And you still want it? Yes, ma'am. The clerk lowered her eyes to the deed papers. The room became quiet except for the ticking clock above the filing cabinets. When Willa signed her name, Margaret pressed a brass stamp into the ink pad and placed the official seal beside the signature. The directions were written in careful handwriting. Take Eaton Road east until you pass the old stone bridge. Turn onto Millbrook Lane. Walk past the walnut trees. The studio sits behind the field. Willa folded the paper and placed it inside her notebook. Before she reached the door, Margaret stopped her. Your last name? Willa turned. Hart. The clerk's expression changed slightly. Where did you learn wall stenciling? Willa hesitated. From Professor Eleanor Voss. Margaret looked toward the window. I wondered if that name would return. Willa stood still. Margaret removed her glasses. Eleanor spent years searching for descendants of the old painters around here. Your family name appears in some of her notes. My family, not directly, but connected. The clerk walked to an old cabinet and pulled out a thin folder. Inside were copies of historical records, including references to travelling decorative painters who worked throughout Carroll County. Eaton had some of the finest stencil work in New Hampshire, Margaret said. People forget because the walls became covered over. But Eleanor never forgot. She returned the papers to the cabinet. She would have wanted someone like you to see that place. Willa thanked her and stepped outside. The road toward the studio was quiet. Millbrook Lane curved between old fields and stands of bare walnut trees. The branches reached upward like dark handwriting against the winter sky. Halfway there, she passed a small farmhouse where an elderly man stood beside a black and white dog. The dog watched her carefully. The man lifted his hand. "Looking for the old painter's place?" "Yes." He nodded toward the trees. "Been empty a long time." The dog gave one quiet bark before lying back down in the snow. The studio appeared at the end of the field. It was smaller than Willa imagined. The building measured roughly 24 feet by 30 feet, built from hand-cut timber with white clapboard siding that had once been painted bright. The roof sagged slightly near the center, and the stone chimney leaned just enough to show years of neglect. Above the door hung a wooden sign. Most of the letters had faded away. Only a few marks remained. Inside, the first room smelled of old wood, dried clay, and the faint mineral scent of forgotten pigment. Cold air moved through cracks in the walls. The floor creaked beneath her boots. She touched the wall near the doorway. The plaster felt rough and uneven. In the back room, she found collapsed shelves, stacks of curled stencil paper, and brushes hardened from decades without use. Some carried traces of red and yellow pigment beneath the dust. The silence inside the studio was different from the silence outside. It did not feel empty. That first evening, Willa cleared a small space near the wall and placed her blanket on the floor. She ate the last piece of bread she carried and watched the fading light move across the damaged walls. The roof groaned as the temperature dropped. The old building settled around her, and somewhere beneath layers of paint, wood, and years of abandonment, the forgotten studio seemed to remember the hands that had once worked there. The old studio had been waiting for someone patient enough to listen. The first 3 days were not spent restoring the studio. They were spent learning what the building needed. Willa carried water from the old hand pump behind the property. She cleared the frozen path to the outhouse and tested each floorboard before putting her full weight on it. By the third morning, she knew which boards near the back wall complained loudly and which ones held steady. The studio had its own language. A loose hinge sounded different from a damaged beam. A shifting plank sounded different from a board that was ready to split. She listened before she touched. On the 4th day, she walked into Whitcomb Hardware carrying a handwritten list. The store was narrow and deep, with wooden shelves reaching toward the ceiling. The smell of pine boards, metal tools, and machine oil filled the room. Behind the counter stood Harold Whitcomb, a man with a white mustache so thick it covered most of his upper lip. A pencil was always tucked behind his right ear. He looked at Willa's list, then looked at her hands. "You have been working, trying to Harold folded the paper. "Trying is how most people start." Willa counted the money in her pocket. "I need to know what I can afford." Harold opened a small ledger. "Put your name here." She looked up. "I cannot pay today." "I know." "Then why?" Harold placed the pencil back behind his ear. "Because that building has been waiting longer than either of us." He opened a drawer and removed a thin booklet. It was an old home repair manual with handwritten notes in the margins. "My father used this. Take it." Willa hesitated. "I cannot take things for free." "Then pay me when the walls stand." He gave her a small nod. The first supplies came slowly. A wire brush cost $3.25. A chimney brush cost $8.50. A bag of hydraulic lime cost $6.75. A box of rosehead nails cost $4.40. A small bucket of fire clay cost $5.90. A second-hand hammer cost $7. Harold allowed her to keep a running account. Each evening, Willa studied the repair manual beside the small candle she owned. She learned the order of repairs: roof before walls, chimney before winter fire, floors after moisture was controlled. The chimney became her first major task. The old stone stack had absorbed years of rain and freezing temperatures. When she removed loose sections, powdered mortar fell between her fingers like dry sand. She worked carefully. The first step was clearing the flue with a stiff chimney brush attached to extension rods. She removed hardened creosote build-up layer by layer, pulling out years of black residue that had collected inside the passage. It took almost 6 hours across 2 days. She mixed replacement mortar using hydraulic lime and fireclay, keeping the mixture firm enough to hold but soft enough to move with the old masonry. She reset damaged bricks one by one, tapping them into place with the wooden handle of her hammer. The work was slow. Some days she repaired only 3 bricks, but the chimney stopped leaning. When the first evening came that she could safely test a fire, Willa placed small pieces of dry wood inside the hearth. She waited before lighting it, checking the chimney draft one more time. The flame rose. The smoke moved upward. The room slowly changed. For the first time since arriving, the studio held warmth. She cooked a simple meal of beans and potatoes in a small iron pot. The food was plain, but she ate sitting at the table instead of on the floor. The table held. That mattered. During the following week, she began examining the workroom. She did not search for anything valuable. She searched for what belonged. Near the wall stood a wooden stencil frame with a faded bell pattern still pressed into the paper. On a shelf sat 3 round brushes with hardened bristles. A rusted tin held fragments of mineral pigment. A cracked wooden box contained cutting knives with narrow blades. A stack of oil-treated stencil sheets rested beneath a cloth. A small stool beside the window carried marks where someone had repeatedly rested their hand while working. Every object had been used. Every object had a place. Then she noticed the barrel. It sat beneath the back shelf, smaller than the others, made from oak staves darkened by age. A faded mark on the side showed that it had once held red iron oxide pigment. Willa moved it because it blocked the floor. It did not move easily. She expected weight from the pigment inside. Instead, it felt strangely balanced. She tapped the bottom with her knuckles. The sound changed. Not hollow. Not solid. Something between. She lifted the barrel slightly and examined the base. There was a thin cedar disc fitted beneath the wood. The cut was almost invisible. A person had made it carefully. Willa sat on the floor and ran her fingers around the edge. The disc had not been moved in years. She did not force it. The next morning, she returned with a small knife, loosened the edge slowly, and lifted the hidden panel. Inside were wrapped packages covered in oilcloth. The first contained old stencil knives with handles polished smooth from use. The second held small pieces of raw material, preserved paper, brushes, and mineral samples labelled in faded handwriting. The third was a small tin box. Inside the box was money. Not loose bills, carefully folded envelopes. Willa counted slowly. The total was $37,400. There were silver half-dollars dated from the 1800s, Indian head pennies, buffalo nickels, and mercury dimes mixed among the collection. Beneath the money rested a military medal. The year stamped into the metal was 1918. She placed everything back on the table. She did not celebrate. She did not call anyone. The room remained exactly as it had been, but the weight of the studio had changed. There was also a notebook. The cover was worn almost smooth. Inside were 50 stencil designs unlike anything Willa had seen before. Each page showed careful drawings of flowers, leaves, borders, and landscapes. The final page contained a folded letter. She recognized the handwriting immediately. Eleanor had taught her enough about old craftsmen to know when something deserved patience. That night, Willa did not open the letter. She carried a blanket outside and sat beside the dark water behind the property. The winter air moved through the bare walnut branches. The studio window glowed faintly behind her. She watched the reflection on the water until the stars appeared. The old studio had been waiting for someone patient enough to listen. The morning after finding the hidden compartment, Willa waited until the sun reached the back window before opening the letter. She recognized the handwriting before she unfolded it. The same careful slant appeared in Eleanor Voss's old classroom notes, in the margins of repair books, and on the small labels attached to preserved pigments. The paper had been folded along the same creases for decades. Willa sat at the work table, placed the stencil notebook beside her, and opened the letter. My dear one, whoever you are, if you're reading these words, then the studio has found careful hands again. My name is Eleanor Voss, and I write this knowing that I may never meet the person who opens this letter. My doctors at Concord Regional Medical Center told me in March of 1998 that I had an advanced heart condition that would not allow me many more years. Dr. Samuel Whitaker explained it gently, as doctors often do when they know a person is listening for time rather than answers. I returned to this studio because I wanted the last part of my work to remain where it began. The craft carried by these walls came through 4 generations of patient hands. Amos Bell, born in 1811 in Eaton, New Hampshire, learned decorative painting from travelling craftsmen and recorded his first stencil patterns in 1834. His daughter, Clara Bell, born in 1842, preserved those designs while working near Conway, New Hampshire. Clara's son, Thomas Bell, born in 1875, continued the trade after moving to Tamworth and taught his children the old methods of mineral colour and milk paint. My grandmother, Ruth Bell Voss, born in 1910 in Meredith, New Hampshire, kept the final family notebooks until they came to me. The trade officially closed on October 14th, 1967. After that day, the brushes were wrapped, the patterns were stored, the walls became quiet. More than 30 years passed in silence. I kept the money because craftsmen before me understood something important. A tool cannot work without material. A roof cannot hold without repair. A person cannot continue without a place to begin again. The savings inside this barrel are not payment for finding this room. They are permission to continue what others abandoned. My husband, Charles, was lost during the Second World War in 1944 near Anzio, Italy. My brother Daniel never returned from Vietnam in 1968. Their names belong beside this work because every generation carries something forward, even when they are gone. If you restore this studio, remember the details. Mix iron oxide pigment slowly into milk paint until the colour settles evenly. Allow the mixture to rest for 12 hours before use. Keep stencil paper treated with linseed oil for at least 2 weeks before cutting, so the edges remain strong. Hold the stencil brush upright and use short tapping motions. Too much pressure pushes paint beneath the pattern. Warm the room before applying milk paint, below 55 degrees Fahrenheit. The surface will not accept the colour properly. Do not hurry. A wall remembers the hand that touches it. The inheritance here is not the money. Money disappears when people only look at what it can buy. The true inheritance is knowing how to repair something that others have decided is finished. Leave the door open for someone who needs a beginning. Leave kindness where you find damage. And when you are uncertain, return to the work itself. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You're welcome here. Eleanor Margaret Voss, September 2nd, 1999. Willa read the letter once, then she read it again. The second time, she noticed small details she had missed before, the careful spacing between sentences, the places where Eleanor's handwriting became lighter, the slight pressure marks where the pen had rested. She folded the paper along the original creases. Exactly as it had been, She carried the letter through the back door and walked toward the edge of the property. The marker Eleanor mentioned was not large. It was a flat piece of fieldstone beside an old walnut tree, partly covered by moss and winter leaves. Willa brushed away the debris. A carved symbol appeared, a small stencil brush crossed with a flower pattern. The same mark appeared on the old notebook cover. She placed her hand against the stone. Nothing moved, nothing opened, but she understood. Some things were meant to be found before they were used. That evening, she returned to the studio and lifted one of the old brushes from the hidden compartment. It was a simple tool. The wooden handle was worn smooth where another person's fingers had held it. Willa cleaned it carefully, mixed a small amount of pigment, and placed the brush beside the warm stove. She did not paint the wall. Not yet. She only prepared the tool. The next weeks brought small kindnesses from people who never asked for anything in return. Margaret Ellis at the county office brought copies of historical records and left them folded neatly on the desk. Harold Whitcomb continued adding supplies to her account and never mentioned the growing balance. The farmer near Millbrook Lane left a bundle of dry wood beside the path without saying who had placed it there. The old man with the black and white dog stopped one morning and repaired a loose section of fence while his dog watched from the snow. Kindness rarely arrived loudly. Most often, it simply appeared beside a door. Sometimes it was a warm meal, a repaired tool, or a person choosing to believe someone else's hands could still build something. What is one small kindness someone once gave you that you still remember today? Perhaps it was something simple that lasted longer than the person expected. Share it with us if you would like. Stories like those are how ordinary moments remain alive. That night, Willa slept beside the work table. The stencil notebook rested near her pillow. The old brushes and the letter remained beside her. For the first time in a long while, she was surrounded by things that had been kept. The first snow arrived on December 6th, 2023. 6 inches covered the field overnight, pressing down the weak sections of the roof that Willa had marked during her first inspection. She sat at the work table and read Harold's repair manual 3 times before touching the materials. Each reading showed her something different. The first explained the order. The second revealed the mistakes beginners made. The third showed her where patience mattered most. The roof measured approximately 24 feet by 30 feet. Willa calculated that she needed 12 bundles of cedar shingles, enough felt underlayment for the full surface, and nearly 5 pounds of galvanized roofing nails. Harold Whitcomb placed the supplies beside his truck. Then he handed her an old leather roofing hatchet. "My uncle used this," he said. "He would want it working." Willa held the worn handle. "I cannot repay you." Harold shook his head. "Then use it carefully." The local elder who helped her was Walter Ames, a retired roofer who walked with a slight bend in his shoulders. He arrived each morning wearing faded work clothes and carrying his own measuring tape. When Willa offered money, he refused. "Your roof needs hands, not payment." For 11 days, they worked. They replaced damaged rafters, marked straight lines with chalk, and secured each shingle with the same 3-stroke nail technique Walter had used for decades. "That nail's proud." Willa looked at the raised edge. "Pull it." She removed it and set it again. By mid-December, the roof held against the snow. The studio no longer sounded like it was asking for rescue. January brought colder nights. The chimney repairs from the first month had stopped the worst damage, but deeper inspection revealed several bricks suffering from spalling. The old mortar had turned into powdered fragments that collected at the base. Willa removed the failing sections carefully and rebuilt them using a mixture of hydraulic lime and fireclay, keeping the ratio close enough to match the original flexibility of the masonry. The work lasted 3 weeks. Most mornings stayed in the 20s Fahrenheit. Her fingers became numb every 15 minutes, forcing her to warm them beside the stove before returning outside. She learned not to fight the cold. She learned how to work with it. The final repair was completed near the end of January. For the test fire, she used dry maple wood and watched the smoke leave the chimney cleanly into the winter air. No hesitation, no backdraft. The old chimney was breathing again. After the chimney was safe, Willa turned toward the floors. The original white pine planks had survived because they were thick and hand-cut, held together with old rose-head nails that still reflected small pieces of light when cleaned. She rented a random orbit sander from Whitcomb Hardware. The cost was $14 per day. The work required 3 passes. The first with 80 grit paper removed years of surface damage. The second with 120 grit softened the remaining marks. The final 220 grit pass revealed the grain beneath. The floor changed slowly. 3 coats of oil followed, each separated by careful drying time. The final coat required a 48-hour cure before furniture could return. The colour moved from a dull brown toward a deep honey tone, then settled closer to mahogany. Not new. Kept. One morning, Willa planned to finish the last corner of the back room, but the work stopped. A great blue heron stood near the marsh behind the property. It remained perfectly still. She watched it for nearly an hour. That day, she did no repairs. She simply sat near the water and let the studio rest. The windows took longer than expected. There were 8 original openings. 3 had no remaining glass. 4 held cracked panes that needed replacement. 1 still contained the original glass from 1788. Willa preserved that pane exactly as it was. The glass carried tiny waves and imperfections from the old manufacturing process, small signs of the person who created it. For the others, she repaired the frames using traditional glazing methods. She applied DAP 33 glazing putty carefully, pressing it into the wooden channels before smoothing the edges with a glazing knife. The sash cords were replaced with 1/4-inch cotton cord. At each counterweight, she tied a figure-8 knot and tested the movement several times before sealing the frame. The final window was the smallest one in the studio. Willa worked slowly because the wood around it was fragile. When she finished, she stepped outside to inspect the fit. A chickadee landed on the walnut branch beside the window. It stayed there for several seconds, looking through the clear glass. Then it flew away. The studio remained quiet. But now the quiet came through windows that could open again. By late February, Willa turned her attention to the interior walls. The damaged sections around the chimney were the worst. 3 separate patches had failed before she understood why. The old plaster was not simply a surface. It was a system built around movement, moisture, and time. She removed the loose areas until she reached the hand-split oak lath beneath. The original builders had used horsehair plaster, and Harold found an old bag of preserved horsehair stored in the back of his hardware shop. Someone kept this for a reason, he said. Willa mixed lime plaster with the horsehair fibres and began again. The first coat was a scored scratch coat, pressed firmly into the lath. The second was a 3/8-inch brown coat that required 72 hours of curing before the final layer could be added. The finish coat measured approximately 1/8 inch and was applied in thin, patient movements. When she stepped back from the repaired chimney wall, she ran her hand across the surface. "These patches will hold another 100 years, she said it quietly. Not as a promise, as a hope. The studio became part of Eaton's daily rhythm, not because people gathered there, because people quietly helped it continue. Doris Bell, the owner of Maple Leaf Cafe, had silver hair cut close around her face, and always wore a blue apron with one missing pocket button. Each Thursday morning, she left 2 paper bags on Willa's doorstep. Inside were bread, soup ingredients, and sometimes a small pastry. When Willa tried to pay her, Doris shook her head. "Pay me in candles when the shop reopens." That was all she said. Caleb Turner arrived one afternoon on an old Schwinn bicycle with a splitting maul tied across the rear rack. He was 17, thin as a fence post, with a wool cap pulled low over his ears. "I saw the woodpile," he said. Willa reached for her wallet. He stepped back. "No, I should pay you." He looked toward the studio. "My mother said." "About your grandfather?" He never explained further. He simply split the wood and stacked it neatly beside the door. Reverend Boyd walked past the property almost every morning. He was a tall man with a worn leather Bible cover and a habit of tapping his hat twice before leaving. One cold morning, he stopped beside the fence. He looked at the repaired roof, the clean windows, and the warm smoke rising from the chimney. Then he removed his hat. "Keep doing good work." His prayer was only 4 words. "May grace remain here." Then he continued down the road. The cellar remained untouched until February 11th. Willa had avoided it because the foundation work above ground demanded all her attention. The entrance revealed a space beneath the studio measuring 12 by 15 feet. The floor was made of old fieldstone, and 7 granite steps descended into the darkness. At the centre sat a dressed granite slab. A small carved craft mark appeared on its surface. The same symbol from Eleanor's letter. Willa brushed away the dirt but did not lift it. Some doors were not meant to open simply because a person had found them. While checking the 3rd step, she noticed something wedged beneath the stone edge. A small oak box. Inside was a brass key. The bow of the key was shaped like a stencil flower symbol. Beneath it rested a tintype photograph from 1903. The image showed a young woman standing outside the cottage, holding a decorative painting tool. Willa stared at the photograph for a long time. The woman's face carried the same strong line around the eyes, the same shape of the mouth. On the back, written in faded ink, were the words, "Female ancestor, daughter of founder, age 25. Summer of 1903. The key remained on the mantel. Willa did not know what it opened. She did not search for the answer. Not yet. By March, the snow began retreating from the field. The creak behind the studio grew louder each morning. Walnut branches developed small green catkins. The land was returning slowly. Willa decided she would not begin full wall stenciling that spring. The work deserved preparation. She used only 1 coin from the hidden collection to purchase materials for small practice panels. She mixed colours, tested patterns, and learned the rhythm of the old tools before touching the finished walls. The studio no longer needed saving. Now it needed understanding. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Willa completed her first heritage craft piece. It was not a grand mural. It was a single wooden panel painted with a hand-cut stencil pattern of willow branches and small bellflowers. She spent 11 days preparing it. The paper stencil was cut by hand. The pigment was mixed slowly. The brush touched the surface in careful taps, leaving small marks that looked almost identical to those shown in Eleanor's notebook. When the final layer dried, Willa placed the panel above the work table. She did not sign it. The work belonged to a longer line than one person. The studio had changed without losing itself. The original floor remained beneath woven rugs. The repaired chimney warmed the front room. The old brushes rested beside new ones. The walls carried restored patterns beside places where the original paint had been left visible. The building did not look young. It looked cared for. The brass key stayed on the mantel until one afternoon when Willa noticed something unusual about the old walnut tree outside. A small metal plate was attached beneath a section of bark. The shape matched the key. She inserted it carefully. The lock opened. Inside the hidden space was a folded 48-star American flag and a small handwritten note from Willa Voss, dated July 4th, 1944, during the Second World War. The note spoke of waiting, loss, and the hope that future hands would continue the work. It was not a message about fame. It was a message about keeping promises. The military medal found beneath the pigment barrel belonged to Charles, Eleanor's husband. Willa carried it to a quiet ceremony at the Massachusetts National Cemetery on Memorial Day, May 27th, 2025. There was no crowd, no announcement. Only a small marker, a folded flag, and a name that had waited many years to be spoken again. The money remained mostly untouched. Willa used 3 coins from the collection for materials: pigment, paper, and replacement tools. The remaining savings were sealed inside the original envelopes. She marked the box with 3 words. For the next one, the shop reopened quietly. There was no celebration. Doris placed a handwritten index card on the cafe corkboard. Traditional wall stenciling lessons. Small groups. By appointment. Within months, more than 40 names appeared on the mailing list. People came from nearby towns. Some came only to watch. Some came to learn. Caleb returned one spring morning carrying a wooden sign he had carved himself. The letters were uneven but strong. It read, Willa Hart Stencil Studio or Daughters. She smiled when she saw it. You added daughters? Caleb shrugged. Seemed right. The sign hung beside the door. Years after Eleanor's letter, Willa began writing one of her own. She used the same opening words. My dear one, whoever you are. She wrote about the studio, about the tools, about the people who had placed kindness beside her when she had nothing. She wrote that a person did not always inherit a house. Sometimes they inherited the responsibility to care for one. The old studio had been waiting for someone patient enough to listen. She folded the letter carefully and placed it inside the same type of oilcloth used decades earlier. The future would decide who opened it. The stenciled wall painter's studio waits. It has always waited, on the clerk's desk in Carroll County, inside a small wooden drawer. Margaret Ellis still kept the $7 bill Willa had used for the original transfer. The ink had faded, the paper had softened, but the date remained visible, a reminder that some beginnings arrive looking almost impossible. And sometimes $7 is enough to open a door that has been waiting for generations.